took me a little while to get Facebook to get going, so.
Hi, Carol.
Hi.
Carol, can you mute yourself and, well, here I can mute you. And don't do the video. We're just trying to do speaker view probably would be the best way to view this. Okay. All right. Well, my name is Mary Rita Nelson. I am the president of the League of Women Voters here in DeKalb County. And I would like to welcome Irene Rubin. And we had a little write-up on her. She's a political scientist, currently a professor emerita of public administration at Northern Illinois University. Her PhD is in sociology from the University of Chicago, and she has taught public budgeting, qualitative methods, research design, and has written many books. So Irene, I would like at this point to turn the floor to you and get started.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's been a long time since I've given a lecture to anybody. I've been retired for many years. So forgive me if I'm a bit rusty. I'm going to play it a bit by ear. It's obvious that I can't summarize the book in an hour and a half, including questions. I want to encourage you to read the book. Not so much because I want the money for it. I don't really care about that. I don't need it. But I really think it's important that we have all this information, and there's so much more information in the book than I can possibly convey in one session, that I'd really want to encourage you to read the book. But I also want to encourage you to ask questions, because I don't know you. I don't know what your interests are. I don't know how to best forward whatever it is that you know. So, and if you don't ask me questions, I will ask them to myself and try to answer them. So, for example, I might ask myself, what about the fact checkers? Are they reliable? Can I use them? Should I rely on them as a first pass? My answer to that would be, not every fact checker is reliable. Many of them are, but there's an easy way to tell, and that is Pointers, P-O-Y-N-T-E-R-S, is an organization that ranks and evaluates, certifies fact checkers. And the fact checkers are very proud of having been certified. So if you look at their websites, they will very prominently display the Pointers evaluation of them. It's a rigorous examination that includes things like whether if they make a mistake and they're caught at it, how quickly do they correct it, if at all, for example, and how reliable are they? So this is a really useful way of sorting out which fact checkers you could rely on and which ones are set up by those people who don't want to be checked. And there are some of those. Irene,
yes. Could I interrupt you?
Sure.
Can you spell that again for me? I'm going to put it in the chat.
P-O-Y-N-T-E-R-S, Pointers. And I think that's an apostrophe S, but I'm not positive. And the certification is IFCN. So if you see the initials IFCN, that means it's a reliable fact checker.
F-I-C-N.
IFCN.
Oh, thank you.
That may be the most useful bit of information you get tonight. It's certainly, I've relied on it myself.
Okay, thank you.
I can't give you a magic bullet that's going to reverse the beliefs of those who have already accepted conspiracy theories and who readily accept whatever distortions and lies are out there, and they're all over the place. There's no easy answer to that, but you can successfully curtail the spread of false information if you know what you're doing. And so that's what I'm going to encourage you to try to to adopt certain strategies for curtailing the spread of false information. And I'm going to try to motivate you to read the book. And I can suggest some strategies that are more likely to work and some strategies that are less likely to work when it comes to persuading or dissuading others. Now, since I don't know who you are, and I don't know how much you know, I'm going to assume that most of you, if not all of you, recognize at least some of material that's dubious, that lacks evidence, that's questionable, at least some of it, maybe not every bit of it, but some of it. And what has occurred to you over time is, how should I react to this? And that's something that everybody needs to know. And it's not something that's really highly touted in the literature, is what steps to take. So I'm going to focus on that first, because otherwise I'll take all the time with other things and I won't get to it. And that's probably the key thing that most of you want to know. And certainly one of you at least has asked me about that. So I'm going to start with that. How should I respond when I find something that's dubious and important? The first principle is, don't repeat the false information, even to correct it. You don't say, this is what it says, but I disagree. By repeating it, you simply embed it. People remember the false information and don't remember your correction. That's psychology. It shouldn't work that way, but it does. So don't repeat it. That's step number one, or principle number one. Principle number two, when you find it, let someone know. Don't be selfish. Don't be quiet. Let somebody know what you found, including the fact checkers, because many of the fact checkers rely on readers to tell them what something is going on. They don't read everything, they don't hear everything, and they welcome reports. And when you do, they are then going to run with it. And when they run with it, they not only check it out, but they also spread it to the rest of the world. So they become a megaphone. That's one thing that you can do with the information that you found. And of course, you can respond to newspaper stories. They often have a way of responding to individual stories, or sending a letter to the newspaper, which may or may not get published, but it might. And there are bloggers out there, there are federal agencies that deal with some of the issues. Anybody who has a megaphone, you want to reach them. Anybody who has both a megaphone and a desire to block falsehoods. Or get your own megaphone, make your own blog or your own book, or whatever you can reach to some organization that you know or familiar with. Let everybody who knows, who can tell anybody else, let them know. And maybe get involved in direct action. There are ideas outlined in the book for how to do this, what kinds of organizations are engaged in this, how you can participate with them, whether it's you're doing the fact checking yourself, or whether it's working with them and helping them along, or even funding them. The third principle that I would say is, whenever possible, take the initiative. If the question is, how do I deal with my Uncle Max, who is, so obstinate and so certain of his opinions, and they're all wrong? How do I deal with that? The best procedure, the one that works the best, is to take the initiative. Get information to them before they hear the false version. It's called inoculation, and it's the best, the most functional strategy. So you present information before the falsehood reaches your friends, your acquaintances, your relatives. It's much easier than trying to undo something that people have already accepted and become ego involved in maintaining. Nobody likes to say, I was wrong. Boy, am I stupid. So you don't want to get into that if you don't have to. So let me give you some examples from the book about how this might work. This is actually one that I've used. Hey guys, guess what? I ran across this really intriguing data this morning that showed that some police departments were able to reduce the number of unarmed Blacks they shot and killed by adopting a series of policies about the use of deadly force. And the really interesting kicker, the police were less likely to get shot or hurt afterwards. It didn't make them more vulnerable to violent criminals. Okay, that's one of the stories that goes around. It says we can't do this because it'll make the police more vulnerable. Actually, it doesn't. You might get some leading questions back, such as, did it make the police more reluctant to go after criminals? You should anticipate a series of questions, an attempt to tear down whatever you're saying. So you need to imagine the responses and be prepared to answer them. You have to do your homework before you present something like that. Now, in general, there's two definite strategies to take for responding to individuals or to groups. One is just to correct the facts, to have the facts at hand. Remember, you're not going to repeat what the falsehood, but you don't just you can just kind of correct it. The second one is a more sympathetic approach. You agree with parts of their story or parts of what they might accept based on their experiences that fits their beliefs. And you refer to sources that you're pretty sure that they will trust. And then you add the new information. So the second one is more supportive than the first. First works really well when you're responding to a newspaper story. You just kind of get the facts out. Attacks on minorities based on they don't pay taxes and they absorb services. Turns out not to be true. So you rely on the facts, just a quick answer, perhaps on a newspaper blog, and you do part of it, and somebody else that you know does part of it, and you divide it up so that everybody is quick bullet type information. And the people who perpetrate the falsehood are unlikely to change, but there are a lot of other people listening, and those are the ones you want to reach. Some of them will change their minds based on a purely factual basis that's well documented. The more sympathetic approach works better in face-to-face interactions because it acknowledges the assumptions and experience of the person you're talking to. It's much less threatening. So one example that occurs to me is to avoid threatening people. You don't say, you don't imply even that they were stupid or that the mistake was theirs. You imply that it was somebody else's and, it's not their fault that they picked it up. So one of the things that occurs in climate change denial is people who say, understandably, gee, the weather's been awfully cold lately and snowy. This whole business of climate change is all made up. It's not real. Okay. And so the response to that, or one response to that, could be, well, I know there are a lot of people online and the weather broadcasters sometimes and the pundits. They make a mistake they confuse weather and climate. And maybe that's what you've picked up. Weather is what happens, on a day-to-day basis, and it varies a lot from place to place and time to time. But climate is over generations. It's over many, many years, and it's over the whole globe. It's over everybody, and that's what's been changing. So my guess is that once that information is at hand, every time that person encounters the mistake, and they will encounter it again, they're going to feel smart, not stupid, but smart, because they now know the difference. So that's kind of the tactful, let's say the tactful approach. Another perspective on this is that part of what you're trying to get across is not necessarily the factual matter. You're not simply correcting a story. What you're trying to get across is the way you think about it, the analysis that you perform, the questions that you ask, so that somebody absorbs, without even really thinking about it, a more analytical perspective that they can then bring to other situations. So this example is from the book. You could say something like this: have you been following the case of the women's soccer team claiming that they're getting paid less than the men? And that's something that's likely to engage people in conversation. A judge just ruled that the women have no case because they earn the same amount as the men last year. But their base pay is a lot less than the men's. The women's team won a lot of their games, and they got bonus pay for each victory. The men also get bonus pay for victories, but they didn't win very many games. The judge didn't pay any attention to the difference between bonus pay and base pay. Kind of an interesting case. It'll probably be appealed. It doesn't matter where the conversation goes from there. Some may think the judge was right, others may think the judge was wrong, or that women's sports get lower attendance, whatever. It doesn't matter how they react to the content of it. What matters is not your conclusion, but the process of looking beyond the first paragraph of a story, beyond the first sentence, beyond what the conclusion is supposed to be, looking for what might be missing. If they pick up that clue, you have done a world of good. The other thing to keep in mind is that people tend to accept the ideas of those in their immediate circle of friends, acquaintances, relatives. And the more they hear the ideas that you're espousing, the more likely they are to accept them. So numbers matter. The more people there are in their network who are giving them the counter information, the better. So numbers count. Even if you're just responding to a news story, get some other people to work along with you, or join an organization where people can focus together. Okay, any questions at this point? Okay, jump in whenever you feel like it. The next point that I'm going to get to is, why is it important that we reduce the impact of dis and misinformation? And why does it fall to us? Why do we have to educate ourselves? And I really think we do have to do this. The problems that result from misinformation, disinformation are so severe that we really need to do something. And those that we expect to do it for us either can't or won't. So let me talk first about what the impacts are of our failure to do this. If we don't motivate ourselves to learn better and to actively respond to these issues. I've grossly categorized them into three groups. One of them is the health concerns, the false information about health, which should be on everybody's mind, having just experienced 2 or 3 years of pandemic. The anti-vaxxers, for example, which were not only about the pandemic, but about all kinds of vaccinations. The health consequences of lack of vaccination, keeping certain diseases alive, killing people. I mean, it makes so little sense, but it's a rejection of science, rejection of don't tell me what to do. There's a series of things involved in that, a lot of false information. And then there was the promotion of false cures. Difference between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is accidental. People speaking out of ignorance or what they think that they know. Disinformation is intentional with a certain purpose in mind. And the purpose is, you can often figure out what the purpose is of the disinformation. You may not always know who promoted it, but you can see what its purpose is. And that can be a clue that you need to pay more attention to it, and that it might potentially be false. So that's a relatively simple distinction. Anyway, with the health issues, you get false cures, which also poison people. Again, it's hard to think of something more serious and onerous than that. And in the book, there's an example of a young man who had cancer, who bought a false description of how to cure himself and was dead within the year. This is really dangerous stuff, this misinformation. The second point that I wanted to make about the consequences of false information is that it typically deepens societal splits. It foments negative stereotypes, such as anti-Hispanic mythology, shall we say. It's anti-immigrant, it's anti-LGBT. And examples, for example, that immigrants bring Hansen's disease, which is the real name for leprosy. And that, of course, is bound to scare people, even though if you know anything about the disease, you know it's currently quite not just treatable, but curable. But it'll frighten people, and that's the purpose. That immigrants bring drugs, they bring gangs and crime, and that undocumented immigrants get benefits that non-immigrants don't get. It's actually not true, but it's one of the bits of misinformation that's out there that creates and builds resentment, and that's the purpose of it. Part of the purpose of all this, or part of the driving misinformation is called replacement theory, and the way that you attack Jews, Blacks, others, is that they're going to replace the white, especially white male dominant society, and therefore they have to be destroyed, controlled, deported, whatever it is that you're going to do to them. You take this as an assumption, this replacement theory is going to push everybody else out or minimize them, or women, for example, are going to take the jobs of men. There's a variety of examples of how this works, but the general theory is called replacement theory, and it's heinous. Okay. We have another example of the harm that can be done here, is in terms of splitting people apart, is in India. False news encouraged anti-Muslim riots, again, burning stores and all that we think of in terms of pogroms. All of that activity was stimulated by false news on the websites. So it creates real life violence. Now, the third issue that I wanted to talk about in terms of the consequences is the one that should appeal most closely, I think, to the League of Women Voters. I'm assuming that highlights that you are interested in voting, in citizenship, and in democracy. Of course, election disinformation stimulated efforts to overthrow the government. It's a little hard to imagine anything more fundamental than that. Loss of belief in the honesty of elections threatens democracy. False claims of election cheating have encouraged purges of voter registration lists. Now, it's one thing to keep your voter registration lists up to date. It's another thing to knock people off of your voter registration list who are eligible to vote. And millions of voters, millions, we're talking millions now, have been purged in error. That is to say, they were eligible and were taken off of the rolls. And at least 4 of those purges were illegal in Florida, New York, North Carolina, and Virginia. They violated the National Voter Registration Act. Now, part of what has gone on here is that efforts to keep your voter registration list up to date have led state secretaries of state and those who are responsible for the votes to rely on data from organizations that are created by the states that share their data in some way. The first one was Crosscheck, and it was actually canceled indefinitely in 2019 for failed security. It was an ACLU case, American Civil Liberties Union's case, but it was notoriously, the database was notoriously inaccurate. It matched only the first and last name and the date of birth. It would therefore find false matches for almost any common US name. So this is what the states were using to presumably launder their lists of errors. They were making new errors, but all in the same direction, that is tossing people off. Okay, so we have another database that's better, that's created in 2012. And this is a number of states get together and they share their data. It's called the Electronic Information Registration Center, ERIC. It includes data on deaths, auto licenses, etc., in order to keep the state's voter registrations clean. Nothing wrong with that as an idea. But 9 Republican states pulled out of ERIC recently, this past year or so, falsely claiming bias and violations of privacy, dropping the number of members from 34 to 24 plus DC due to a conspiracy theory claim. Aha, one of those. The claim was that there was left-wing bias associated with George Soros. Now, if you've been following the false news, especially as it comes from the right, from some of the uh, uh, websites that specialize in false news, like Gateway Pundit. If you see the name George Soros, who's a Jewish philanthropist, he's one of their best targets because he has fostered democracy around the world using his money. And so therefore, he becomes the villain, and he's attributed all kinds of things. One of them was that he founded or funded and controls this Eric. He doesn't. He gave a contribution to another organization that helped set it up. There's no evidence that he ever had any direct connection with the organization. And in years since that was founded, it's funded by the members. So he has absolutely no control and no role in it. So the name alone should be a kind of a clue that this is based on false information. But as a result, these states that are presumably trying to keep their registration list clean pull out of a data set that would have helped them keep it clean. And instead, they're struggling finding information, and they end up using things like the post office list of people who have moved, which is not a very good list. It doesn't help them. They're much worse off. They're more likely to get that same problem that was in cross-check of names that are similar and that are not vetted. So they made the situation worse by them buying the false information that they perpetrate or that their allies perpetrate. So it gets complicated, but it's layers on layers of misinformation. Okay. Any questions to this point before I move on to the next step? Okay, so I hope I've convinced you. Yes, got a question?
Got one question. Would you like to define the difference between misinformation and disinformation?
Okay, I think I did that before, but somebody else who's on now may not have heard. Misinformation is usually by chance. It's somebody who just didn't know the correct answer or thought that they knew, but they didn't really. It's not because they're malevolent and they didn't intentionally, with a purpose, try to distort information. Disinformation is intentional. It has a purpose, which you can often see. It might be to destroy the unions or to reduce spending in public sector or to make sure that a woman doesn't get elected to president or anything else that you can see. That's disinformation. It's intentional, and you can often figure out what the intent is. Okay. Moving along. I think, and I hope I've convinced you that this is something really serious and that we have to deal with this. The society has to deal with it. Now the question is, why do we have to deal with it? Why do we in this group, why do we as intelligent folks, as intelligent, educated folks have to deal with this? Why does everybody have to deal with this? And why does the task fall to us? Why not to government? Why not to social media that perpetrates these stories? And some states are actually mandating media literacy courses for public schools. A number of states are doing this, and it's a good step, although it is criticized by the right, who fear that their views will be censored. Okay, so even the efforts to educate are being blocked at times. The first answer to why do we have to do it is that the educational approach works, while many others do not. Some countries have adopted this plan of educating through the schools, and they have far less problem with disinformation. Okay, you don't control misinformation so well, and we'd like to be able to tell them apart if we can. Okay, the second issue is that governments around the world often use media controls as a form of censorship. They do use it to block certain views, and even where they're not actively doing that, they're charged with doing it. Okay, like the United States government is charged with censorship because it tries to block false news. In the European Union, media controls have been passed, and they were supposed to become effective this past August, but they're awfully hard to enforce. The enforcement is huge fines, but Amazon is fighting them in court, predictable. And X, Twitter, now X, has disbanded much of its staff that had the role. And it's not clear that the European Union has the authority to enforce the new rules. And the size of social media makes it nearly impossible to police effectively. So governments have a really difficult time doing this. And the social media platforms have been unwilling and or unable to control lies, distortions, exaggerations, mis and disinformation. Some platforms even seem to welcome them or even specialize in them. What about the fact checkers? They help, they can help, but they don't consider everything, and not all of them are neutral. And they are accused of bias by the right wing. So they don't convince everybody. If the right wing says, no, no, that's false news, they don't have that much effect. They can help us though. Okay. Now, let me give you an example of what's going on here. The social media platforms have stepped back from both transparency and moderation. And I don't mean moderation in the sense of being moderate. I mean in the sense of moderating the posts, checking out and making some of the posts be taken down. They're backing off of that. They're not increasing it as the problem increases. They're backing away from it. Twitter has abandoned many of the policies and design innovations that protected users from disinformation. Twitter removed its state-affiliated media labels that allowed users to identify content coming from government-controlled media. Simultaneously, companies including X have powered down their free application programming interfaces. That means that researchers no longer have, and journalists no longer have access to data sources that allow them to distinguish between organic rumors, misinformation, people that spread things that they thought were true but aren't, and disinformation campaigns. Very hard now to tell them apart. And beyond that, Musk sued disinformation researchers at the Center for Countering Digital Hate, which is a very useful source, presumably because it drove away advertisers. So if you tell the world that there's disinformation here, advertisers may not want to get onto your website, and that would hurt him in the pocketbook, and he doesn't want that. So you have fear of lawsuits going on here, actual lawsuits, court intervention, and threats. One of the efforts to threaten those that try to monitor the web is led, ironically, by Jim Jordan, a name which should be fresh in most people's minds because of his attempt to become speaker. Academics, universities, and government agencies are overhauling or ending their research programs designed to counter the spread of online misinformation and disinformation amid a legal campaign from conservative politicians and activists who accuse them of colluding with tech companies to censor right-wing views. So the charge of censorship here is being used to dissolve, to threaten, to remove those academics and agencies that were monitoring false information. So we're losing one source after another that could have and did, to some extent, do this for us. The situation is actually getting worse. The Washington Post had an article recently that Stanford University is facing litigation over its efforts to block or to trace misinformation. And the National Institute of Health froze a program that was to improve communications, citing regulatory and legal threats. So that's where we are in terms of who could help us if we don't do this ourselves. So what do we do? Where are we? If the problems are getting worse and the ability of somebody else to help us is diminishing, what do? We have to educate ourselves and fight back, both. Taking as many people as possible with us. The 3 steps. Recognize what might be false, confirm or disconfirm You might be right, you might be wrong. You can't assume that just because it's suspicious that therefore it's wrong. Even some conspiracies are actually real. And then if you find something that is serious, that was wrong, you have to know how to respond, and you must respond. You shouldn't just sit there and say, well, I guess it was wrong. So what's the first step? Most of you know some of the obvious steps for recognizing false and misinformation. You might recognize it immediately if it comes in your field. And there are some things that are obvious, but there are some things that you may not pay enough attention to. And you don't pay attention to everything. And some of them are fairly subtle. So I'm going to go through a list of these just to refresh in your mind and get you into the habit of asking some kind of questions like, I wish this were true. I'm going to find out if it is, because there's a confirmation bias. The psychologist will tell you about that. So if you want it to be true, you're more likely to accept it without questioning it, without looking for the evidence. So getting into the habit of saying, what's the evidence for that? I wish it were true. I wonder if it is. Okay. These things are all around us, and they're close. These examples come from daily reading of the news, not from the book that I wrote 2 years ago. For example, recently, and this is a screw up from somebody who should have known better. Hamas claimed that Israel was responsible for bombing a hospital and killing some 500 people. And the New York Times immediately ran with it without questioning it. And having run with it, they did a lot of damage. That some negotiations which would have been underway were canceled. And the result may have been additional loss of life. It's easy to think that could have happened. We don't know that for sure, but it seems likely. The Times eventually, and I mean weeks later, sort of apologized that they knew better, that they should have looked for some evidence and didn't. They never asked themselves, what's the evidence for that? Nor did they ask themselves, is Hamas a reliable source for this information? Should we simply run with it because they said it? Okay. So there are two questions there that you need to, from the example of this serious screw up, two things that you should pull out of it. One, is this a reliable source? Should I look into it further? And two, what's the evidence? Is it presented? Is it credible? Okay. Let me give you an example from closer to home. It's a mini case from DeKalb, Illinois. A critic of the city circulated a picture of downtown during homecoming, showing that there were few people in the street and arguing that it was a waste of taxpayer money for overtime for public employees, for public works. In response, someone wrote that the photo was taken before the event began. Don't know, question mark. Then the poster of the misleading photo argued back, you're just defending the city because you have a contract. Aha. Even if you hadn't gone to homecoming and seen that it was well attended, the response, you're saying that because you have a contract, falls into the category of attacking the credibility of opponents rather than the substance of their arguments, or the logic that they were using, or the evidence. That should make you suspicious. So get into the habit of recognizing when somebody attacks the credibility of the speaker without addressing the substance of the argument, something may be incorrect and possibly intentionally incorrect. And in this case, it was intentional. You don't take a picture before the event and claim that nobody was there without doing it intentionally to make a point. In this case, the point was he was trying to make sure that the taxes would stay low. That's his goal. If you know this person, you have that history. You most likely know and recognize the obvious triggers, such as websites that frequently publish false or distorted material. If you're not familiar with them, there are a number of lists that you can get of them. Some of them are pretty good. Wikipedia offers one of them, which is easy source to get at. CBS has compiled a list. There are a number of lists out there that are easy to check. And once you recognize that the source is one of these websites, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's false, because they have to put out some real stuff in order to maintain their credibility, but it should make you suspicious if it comes from one of these sites. Some of them have the names similar to real sites in order to increase their credibility and make you think that it's CBS or something when it isn't. But some of them are just purveyors of false information. Okay. Obviously, if it seems unlikely to be true, that should rouse your antenna should go up. For example, ones that I've run across in recent times: Pope endorses Trump. That seemed to me, on the face of it, unlikely to be true. Another one: Germany is under Sharia law. I can imagine where that came from and what its purpose is, but that is so unlikely to be true that you should be suspicious. You should also look for phrases like "everyone knows." If you see one of those, it should bring your antenna up or your eyebrows up or whatever, because probably not everybody knows or says, and it's intended to be psychological pressure. Who wants to be the only one who doesn't know, right? If everybody knows, then I should know it too, right? But it doesn't provide any evidence either that everybody knows or for the argument that they're making. So that's pretty obvious. Some of the clues, though, are a little more subtle, you might not be in the habit of looking for them. For example, blame shifting. For example, Antifa, anti-fascist, but the shorthand version is Antifa, caused the riot. Okay, blaming somebody else for what you did and what you're being blamed for. Whatever you accuse me of, you have done or are doing. That's a common form. If you can put the argument in that form, it should make you suspicious. And distracting. This is another form of argumentation. If you catch it, if you can say, hey, they're just trying to distract from the original, you should be suspicious. This one has a name. It's called whataboutism. What about kids who drive drunk? That's more important than gun control. More people are killed in accidents than with guns. So pay attention to the driving and not to, or marijuana or whatever, not to guns. It's intended to be a distraction. If you see one of those, be cautious. Example: McCarthy, in a fiery exchange with a reporter, blamed Democrats for bringing chaos with the ouster of a speaker. Okay, blame shifting. Fox News host blames Biden for lack of ambassadorial appointments to the Middle East, when Republicans in the Senate have blocked the appointments. Third example: a budget is held up and blocked by Republicans who blame the lack of a budget on, you guessed it, President Biden, because he didn't implement border controls that Republicans want. So if you see something that looks like blame shifting, you should be a little bit cautious about accepting it. Another one is attacking the credibility of the speaker rather than the argument. And I've heard a number of these around DeKalb. You aren't a parent. You can't speak to school issues. You can't oppose a project because you haven't lived here for 20 years. That's another one that I actually heard at a meeting. You can't argue for gun control because you are not a student survivor, even if you were. The crisis actors claim. These are not real people who were really shot. They were just pretending in order to train people how to deal with first responders, how to deal with a gun incident of some sort. So you claim that the whole incident isn't real so that you don't have to deal with it, the implications for gun control. Related to attacking credibility is what I call delegitimization. Includes name calling. If you hear name calling in an argument, immediately you should be suspicious. But there are conspiracy theories, the main purpose of which is to delegitimize someone. You don't have to deal with whether Hillary Clinton would be a good president. All you have to do is say that she was involved in some child sex ring, and that delegitimizes her and end of discussion, takes her out of the picture, right? It's clear what the purpose of that kind of claim is, and a number of people forwarded it. This was the child that Hillary was running a sex ring out of Ping Pong Pizza Parlor, which some people believed, by the way. Another thing that you should pay attention to is arguments from authority. We have a tendency to accept authority. So if somebody famous argues this, perhaps we should accept it. My argument would be the opposite. If you're just using an argument for authority and not providing the evidence, be suspicious. Some of the people who are used as authorities really don't know anything. They're just famous. For example, some actress who sells health products and she's pretty. Therefore, by association, if you buy the health product, you'll be pretty too. Think about the logic of that argument. Yeah, she's not even an expert. So claiming expertise as your main evidence, doctors say, doctors agree, da 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 da. Be suspicious. Another one has a name. It's called praeter ideo. If you catch this one, you should react immediately. Some people say you're trying to make a point, but denying that you're making that point. So some people say that Obama was a Muslim. I'm not saying that, but some people say it. Or some people say that China is responsible for the pandemic. I don't say that, but some people say it. It's a way of saying it without taking the responsibility for having said it, or actually providing any evidence for it. So praeter ideo, saying it without saying it, should make you suspicious. Another one that's getting a little bit more subtle is ruling out disliked options. How do you rule off the table things that you don't want to happen? You only want certain things to be considered. One of them is that it doesn't solve the whole problem. Yeah, sure, it might work, but it can't be scaled up. So take that one off the table. You can't, there are no alternatives to fossil fuels. Either it can't be, it'll cause more harm than good. It'll make food crops more expensive and the poor will starve. That's a little exaggeration of the story, but not a big one. Those are real arguments. So ways of taking an option that you don't like off the table. Think about what they are. Alternatives to fossil fuels, for example. You want to take them off the table. Ways of dealing with global warming, whatever it is, you want to take it off the table completely. So you say it can't be scaled up. Okay. All right, where am I going next? Another thing you should pay attention to is a slippery slope. If you run across this, it's a fairly common form of argumentation. You can't ban automatic weapons because next they'll take our guns away. So you can't register them. You can't do anything that might in the future imply that next thing they're going to do is take them away because they don't like them. So these controls, any controls, mean that you're going to lose them. That's supposed to motivate those who are gun owners to oppose any form of gun control. An argument in Iran that women cannot take off their head covering because that leads to nakedness and divorce and dissolution of the family. And I'm not making that one up. So the notion is that A leads to C, D, E, F, whatever it is, that is completely rejected by you, by society. And so therefore you cannot consider A. Now, when you come across a slippery slope argument, you need to think about it because some are real. There's some mechanism behind it that the first step may lead to a second step or a third step. But unless that mechanism is specified and you can figure out what it is, you can reject. It's pretty safe that you can reject the argument, but you need to look into it. I would say pay attention to false dichotomies. The either or, it's either this or that. And as a rhetorical device, not only does it oversimplify by assuming that there's only two choices, and therefore you can take the disliked options off the table, only two choices, but there's only one that sounds acceptable. You phrase the second one in such a way that it must be rejected. So it's for example, you're either anti-abortion or you're a baby killer, okay? And the rhetoric is almost that obvious, but there are a lot of others that are not quite so obvious and that you need to pay more attention to. So if you see dichotomies, you need to ask yourself whether they're real, whether there's really only two options and only one of them is acceptable. Okay, you're either with me or against me. You're either with me or you're you're either with, oh, one that was recent was you're either with the president or you're with the Constitution. Now, does that make any sense? You either support the president or you support the Constitution. What is your role? Well, it seems to me that, first of all, you can be both. And second of all, there are other options. So it's not just oversimplifying, it's trying to control the outcome that you're going to jump to based on that dichotomy. Another thing you should pay attention to if you see it, or that you can phrase it in these terms, is a silver bullet. It's not always called a silver bullet, but if you can put it in that form, if you can say somebody is oversimplifying this and saying that one step is going to solve a whole host of problems, you should look at it because it's probably something that they want to have happen, but it's probably not going to work out. For example, a wall along the border, along the southern border, is going to solve a whole host of problems, right? It's going to solve the drug problems from Mexico. It's going to solve immigration. It's going to hold, well, if you talk to anybody who really is concerned with border control, the fence is, not going to control those things. The drugs are tossed over the top and they're cut. You can take an ordinary saw from the hardware store and cut into a lot of these fence poles. And you can climb over them. There are photographs in the news of people climbing over the top. Okay, so it's an oversimplified proposal, and it won't do the things that it's promised to do. There are people who recommend elimination of zoning. It's going to reduce the cost of housing and eliminate homelessness. Well, it's an oversimplified solution to a fairly complex problem that requires a number of different approaches. So if you can phrase an argument in terms of a magic bullet, that it's oversimplification, then you know to pay more attention to what its goal is, who's perpetrating it, and with what possible outcome and what you should do about it. You need to pay attention to illogic, and that's not always so easy to see. But these are real examples. Again, these are things that I've seen. It could be true, therefore it is true. If you hear it in that form, you know that it's silly, but that's the shape of an argument. For example, the 9/11 conspiracy theories that said that government employees in government were responsible for the destruction of the towers, that there were bombs planted at various places, and that when they went off, the buildings collapsed. But it was done in order to make a war on Middle Eastern countries in order to control the flow of oil. Okay, there was some kernel of understanding in there about what some government officials were proposing, and then it generalizes from there. It said it could have happened this way, therefore they conclude that it did. Okay, so if you recognize that kind of argument, that if you can put it in that form, you should be suspicious about it and check it out. Similarly, it sounds reasonable, so it must be true. I've seen police officers argue that masking, that is for antivirus control, increases robberies. It seemed logical to police officers, if you couldn't see someone in a camera, that they would be more likely to increase robberies. But in fact, it didn't happen. That's not what happened, wasn't the result. So it looked like it was logical, but it really wasn't true. So if you see someone jumping to that kind of conclusion without looking at actual incidents, of robberies, be suspicious. The conclusion may not follow from the evidence. It's something else you need to pay really close attention to when evidence is provided, and it is sometimes, or at least partially provided. It may not follow, the conclusion may not follow from that evidence. For example, the Illinois governor owns health services, so he must have benefited from COVID mandates. In fact, it's not true. He doesn't own any health services in Illinois. Okay, so you needed the next step. It was something missing. The conclusion didn't follow from the evidence that was presented. Another kind of silly one is it worked well for us in the past, therefore it must be okay now. If you could put the argument in that form, you know enough to be suspicious about it. For example, oil and gas have worked well for us for hundreds of years. Therefore, they must still be working well for us. Why do we want to reduce them, right? Another common form of illogic is after this, therefore because of this. In Latin, it's post hoc, ergo propter hoc. But it's important. It sounds, silly, but because of this inoculation, the child died. Okay, the child had an inoculation, it died. Therefore, the inoculation caused the death. It seems so logical for somebody who is suffering from a death of a child that it's accepted, and it was accepted widely. But it isn't true, and it isn't even logical. Lots of things happen after something else without being caused by them. Trump was really big on this form of illogic. I was elected, the economy improved, therefore I improved it. And I'm sure there are people who buy that. Trump made another argument, a form of argument that you need to probably be aware of. It's called false equivalence, treating exactly the same two things that are really different from each other. Trump made equivalent Antifa and MS-13. Antifa, I think in its entire history, has been involved in one death, and I'm not sure that was intentional. MS-13 is a murderous gang that has killed hundreds of thousands of people. Okay, they're not equivalent, not at all. One is anti-fascist, and the other is a murdering gang. But treating them the same is a way of degrading, denying Antifa. Okay, so if you see a false equivalent, if you're looking at things that are being equated and they look to you like they maybe are not equal, or you should check out that they're not equal, it should make you suspicious. Getting a little bit more subtle still is you need to begin to look for things that aren't there. And those are hard to see sometimes, but you got to get into the habit of saying things that should be there aren't there in the argument. The obvious one, the big one, is evidence. Where's the evidence? It's missing. In conspiracy theories, typically evidence is missing, and it can't be found because that's part of the conspiracy. The evidence has been destroyed. So you have to just accept it, right? Let me give you an example. Blaming Kamala Harris for keeping prisoners behind bars too long so that they could serve as emergency firefighters. Is there evidence that it was her policy? Did she endorse it? In reality, the policy was proposed by her staff, but blocked by the courts, so it was never implemented. And she never supported it. And she instructed her staff not to make that argument against early release. So the evidence was missing. Example 2, Todd Akin claimed that women can't get pregnant from rape. You may have heard that at one point. Makes my skin crawl. What was the evidence? He said, doctors say, okay, some doctors say. That trigger should be the expertise, the false expertise. Test cases show that they can indeed get pregnant from rape. And that example is drawn out in the book that shows you how to find the evidence for it. Okay, what else is missing? Oftentimes the rest of the costs, the rest of the story, the outcome All of those things may be missing. So if you look at something and you see its evaluation within a few days or a week or a month, and you get one result, if you looked at it over a year, you'd see something completely different. Okay. A couple of years ago, you might not have thought about the difficulty of choosing a speaker. Okay. But if you waited until now, you'd see the outcome would be very different. So what's missing? Another thing you need to look for is a follow-up question. Okay, somebody makes a statement. What's the next question? Is the next question important, and was it asked? And if not, why not? When a story charges that a given number of non-citizens have voted illegally, you might ask, first, what's the evidence for that? The next logical question should be, is that number big or small? Out of how many total voters? Over what period of time? Then you might want to ask, why were these non-citizens not turned down when they tried to register to vote? So there's missing follow-up questions. For example, in an audit of the 2016 elections, North Carolina investigators caught 41 voters out of 4.8 million who cast a ballot despite being a citizen of another country. Gives you a very different interpretation when you ask the next question, out of how many? Is it a lot or a little? In the Texas case, the Trump tweeted about 58,000 cases, possible cases of non-citizens voting should be compared to 15.8 million registered voters in Texas. Also, the 58,000 was a cumulative number over 22 years. Thus, the potential illegal voters represented a really tiny percent, a tiny fraction of 1% of registered voters each year. Without such follow-up questions, the initial charge is intended to be the unquestioned and misleading disinformation conclusion. You need to pay attention to selection bias, what's called cherry picking, choosing incorrect or misleading comparisons. This is common with right-wing websites that do this all the time. Cherry picking means that you look at only certain years that seem to prove your point in a time series data. And if you looked at a longer series, you'd come up with a different conclusion. This came home to me when I was teaching, and I had a time series and a conclusion in a textbook that the students were reading. And so what I did is I extended the time series out and showed them that with the longer one, there was a different conclusion. And some student who was sitting in on the class from the right-wing auditors posted on a website saying how misleading it was, and I was not allowed to do that. I was not allowed to change the textbook. Okay, that brought that example home to me about extending the time series, what comes next, and cherry picking, choosing a particular time span. It's also common in arguments against global warming, picking a certain number of years that don't seem to prove the point that there is global warming. If you extend the series, you get the picture very vividly. Choosing incorrect comparisons, two states, which one is more liberal than the other, but it has more of something or another else. Which states did you pick for comparisons to come up with your conclusion? And is it a comparison that makes any sense? So when you see two states or anything being compared to come up with a particular conclusion, always ask yourself, is that a sensible pairing? If you took a different pairing, would the conclusion be different? Okay, it's an easy thing to check. Let me give you one final thing to look for, to be sensitive to, and that is something that's unknowable. Somebody makes a claim that so-and-so wants to do this. He wants to eliminate all Jews or all Palestinians or whatever. How do you know? How could you know what somebody wants to do? Are you in their head? Did they say that? Where's the evidence for that? Could there be any evidence for that? Okay, so my question is that you should ask your data, how could anybody know that? How could anybody know that? What's going on in somebody else's mind? Okay, let's pause here Let me see if there are any questions that I can ask or answer, for either answer or ask. It's a lot of material.
Anybody have any questions?
I do.
Carol?
I always have questions. This makes me tired, Irene.
Yeah, I thought it might.
And it also sounds like something, in order to do what you suggest, we would have to have like a monthly discussion group that's available on the minute, to my concern is like, who are you going to tell? I see this stuff every day.
Mhm.
Who am I going to tell that's going to make a difference about this? Maybe that's my question for you.
Well, there's two different questions. There's a lot embedded in that. First, a lot of things that you're going to see are not necessarily important, not important enough to tell people about or that they need to hear, but some of them are. For example, misinformation or disinformation about cures or vaccines and so forth. That's important stuff. And if you run across false information about it, yes, you need to tell somebody about it. And the book outlines who you can tell, how, who has the megaphone. There's a lot of details in the book that I can't reproduce now. You're already overwhelmed with one section of the book, and I haven't gotten to the main parts yet. So my first answer to you is, damn it, read the book. Okay, it's going to answer a lot of your questions. The second thing that you raised is, do we need to convene a group to go over this stuff? That's a perfectly fine solution. It doesn't have to be every day, especially because a lot of things you're going to find are not necessarily important enough to call to everybody's attention. Some of them, however, will be or might be. And you might run across some, and somebody else in this group might run across another one, or they may be self-reinforcing, and discussing it is useful. Okay. So yeah, the more, not just the merrier, the more effective. Just even sharing it with a group. You found something, sharing it with a group is important as a start. Just don't keep it to yourself if it's important. Okay, that's my short answer to that. The longer answer in terms of it's overwhelming is you do get into certain habits and it becomes automatic. So it doesn't really become overwhelming. There's just, you recognize certain patterns that stick out in your head. And beyond that, you don't necessarily have to do it all. Whatever portions of it, if you do some of it regularly, and I'm sure you do, everybody does, do a little bit more. Look for different kinds of arguments. Something that amuses you or that you run into, that intrigues you, some subject area that's important to you. For example, there's a whole host of disinformation about the Israeli-Palestinian war. Maybe that grabs some of you. And if it does, focus on that. Maybe some issues probably grab you for health. I'm thinking of Pat Very, for example. Health may be an important issue for her. Concentrate on those issues. You can focus. You don't have to look at everything. Some of you may be more interested in the arguments against taking action against global warming and the scientific perspective, or anti-science arguments in general may intrigue you. You can focus. You don't have to overwhelm yourself. Just expand a little bit over wherever you are. That's what I'm arguing.
Irene, is there any way, I know I tried the library, I tried NIU's library, I tried Amazon. I was not able to find a place where your book would be available to purchase.
Okay, well, first of all, it's available from the publisher, but it's also available from Amazon. If you can't find it, look at it under the title, look at it under the author. I have found it on Amazon. I know it's there.
Okay.
So it is available. And obviously everybody doesn't have to buy it. One or two of you can buy it and share it. And I believe you can probably get it online as well. They do publish some of their material online.
Is it any cheaper now than it used to be?
They do discount it. They discount it either 10 or 20%. So I just got one of those ads today, and I get them regularly. So it's a little cheaper than it looks. And of course, you'd get the paper. I assume you'd get the paper as opposed to the hardback.
Oh, is it available as a Kindle?
I don't know. I didn't look for that. That might be worth looking for. or an online version.
I'm looking it up right now. Steve, do you have a question?
Yes, I would be interested in the discounted price. I certainly wouldn't discount the content based on what Irene has presented. Very impressed with your presentation. I missed part of it, so I apologize if my question was addressed already. But one of the elements of concern is where you start the time clock in analyzing something. I would point to the Ukraine war as an example. If one only looks at February of 2022 as the starting point, then one gets a different perspective than if one goes back to 2014 or possibly even earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It gives you a greater perspective.
Mm-hmm. I can't disagree with that. It's obviously true. In a case like that, going back historically is important. I think it's not always necessary to do that, but with certain kinds of misinformation, it's clear. For example, a lot of the arguments in favor of the Palestinians have just simply eliminated the initial attack, as if it didn't happen, as if the Israelis were trying to wipe out the Palestinians all on their own. Well, that should suggest to you that there's a history here and that maybe going back is useful. And you obviously want to know, and I think the newspapers point this out, where did this slice of land that's so dense with Palestinians, where did it come from? Why is it there? And I think that pushes you back in time. And the other thing is that a lot of the fact checkers can help here. They tend to refer to, or some of them do at any rate, to broader issues when there's a misinformation or disinformation. So I rely heavily on the fact checkers. It's kind of my first go-to to see if they have responded to it, and usually often several of the fact checkers rather than just one, because they'll mention different things. They don't always refer to the same issues, but you can pose some of these questions to the fact checkers and then they'll get to work on it, which is great because it's going to save you a lot of time and effort.
So Steve, earlier in the chat, you're going to see Irene's preferred fact checker site, which is www.poynther.org/IFCN/.
Okay, let me explain that a little more fully. That's not the fact checker. That's the standard setter for fact checkers.
Oh.
So if you want to look at any fact checker, and there's loads of them, and you want to know how reliable it is, look for the pointer certification, which is that set of initials. They will post them prominently because they're proud of them. It means that they've met all of the standards for honesty, integrity, and quick response for any mistakes that they pose by mistake.
Thank you.
So I'd like to get clear on, you had given us that first thing. Is that where the list is of the other fact checkers? The pointers?
Pointers will also have a list. It'll tell you who the fact checkers are that they've certified.
Okay.
So you can get it that way, or you can look for fact checkers and then see if they have the initials that say that they've been approved.
And
You can do it. You can do it either way.
IFCN, or what was it? Yeah, IFCN, is that the initial?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
Eileen, what do you think of Scopes?
It's the I believe it's the oldest fact checker, and it's reasonably reliable. It maybe doesn't check out the kind of stories that you would be interested in, but if they do check it out, they're reasonably reliable.
Anybody else?
I've got lots more material, but I don't want to overwhelm everybody. I mean, that's the whole point.
Got about 13 minutes left. Irene, do you want to give us 13 minutes of material or?
You want whatever. If you want, I prefer to answer questions because that's what on people's minds. But if they want me to just use the time, I'll keep going. Remember, I used to talk in 3 hour slots when I was a
Yeah,
teacher.
yeah.
No 3 hours, but keep going for the rest of this.
All right.
That's one opinion.
Okay.
I concur.
What was that a question?
No, I was just concurring, but Cynthia has a question now.
Okay.
Hi. So, Irene, I really, really enjoyed that list that you gave. That was, I thought, very, very helpful. I think it helps us to be able to identify how the information is being manipulated. And once we understand how it's being manipulated, then we have a better chance of saying, no, 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 no. That's something, this piece over here, we're not going to take into account. Instead, we're going to, approach this in a different way. I find that very, very useful. I think Carol brought up a good question about, so how do we counter this information? I know in my training, I've been really very seriously taught, as you mentioned, not to click on, not to touch, not to amplify in any way, shape, or form the disinformation. So are there ways, I mean, I would recommend to everyone Indivisible Truth Brigade. It's a wonderful way to counter disinformation. I've been a part of it for years. And if you want any information, just let me know. But are there besides social media, are there other avenues besides, just talking within our own echo chamber amongst ourselves? Is that an area that you might spend the next few minutes talking about?
Well, the book, there's a whole chapter in the book about how to respond to what you find. And there are lots of different ways of reaching different audiences, some of which you may not have thought about. It depends on how much energy and time you're willing to spend on it. For example, you can set up your own blogs, your own, and it tells you how to do that if you want to do it. And that's something that a group might want to get together and do on a particular subject of interest, whether it's health disinformation or global warming or local politics or whatever it is that intrigues you, that you find it most important that accurate information be widely disseminated. So that's something else you can do. But obviously, yes, you've got, when you say social platforms, we're talking not only about X or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, but also about newspapers. Some people still read them, believe it or not, and comment on them. You don't have to reach 1 million people at one time. If somebody reads your comments on the subject, you may reach 20 or 30 or 40 people. That's a good thing because you're not the only one. The idea is that people disempower themselves by saying, well, I can't do much. Why should I do anything at all? But you're not alone. There's a whole lot of other people who are out there trying to do the same thing that you are and that I am trying to do. And together we can do it. And there are examples in the book where this has been done successfully, where the situation was difficult and people got together and put out the factual material and kept hammering it and hammering it and changed public policy and changed the outcome. So it can happen. And the more of us that do it, the better. You're not alone. Your individual effort is magnified by all the other people who are working with you. So yes, this is a message of hope and saying that even small actions count, but there are bigger actions that you can take. For example, there are organizations like the one that was mentioned just recently where you can join, where you can be part of the process of fact checking. There's an online site that will train you into fact checking. They will make you a good fact checker. You could do it for a living if you wanted to. But if the fact checkers don't do it, you can do it yourself. Imagine being able to train as a fact checker online. That's pretty cool. But there are organizations that are more hands-on active, that do protests, for example, that protest stations or platforms that promote hatred, for example. And you can join them. You can help fund them. You can join them. You can do protests and Herb and I have a book about protests. So if you need more information about how to do protests, there's another alternative for you. But as I say, I've got a lot more material, a lot more questions can be answered. If you want to somehow or another get them to me in an email or some other way, I'll try to answer them for you as best I can.
We've got one from Christy Slavinas.
Okay.
Hi, Irene. Thank you very much. I was going to ask you a question about how we can do more for children in critical thinking. And I mean, this sounds a little bit more for maybe an older audience of students, but our League of Women Voters is looking into doing some civics type lessons, going into classrooms if we can. So I was going to ask you if you knew of any books, children's books, because a lot of times a book will spur some good conversation, but then I kind of answered my own question because I remember David Pakman wrote a book called Think Like a Detective, and I wondered if you were familiar with it or any others.
No, I'm not, but I am familiar with a number of states that have mandated computer literacy, online literacy for their schools as part of the curriculum. And so there are curricula out there, and one would simply need to look at some of the states that have mandated that and see what they are using for text. That would be interesting. That would be an interesting follow-up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, 6 minutes. Irene, do you want to wrap it up or should we?
And I have one more question.
Okay, the one more question. Okay.
Earlier on, you talked about Eric, and I wrote down the letters because I wanted to, because I'd heard of it and I wanted to keep that with these notes, but I lost all the words. I think the first was election. Is that right?
Let me look for the letters because I wrote it out. I've got a lot of pages here, and finding what I'm looking for is tricky. If I don't answer your question quickly enough right now, you know how to email me and
Yes,
I'll
I
get it
do.
to you.
Thank you.
Why is it you can never find something when you're looking for it? Okay. Eric, Electronic Information Registration Center.
Electronic, second word?
Electronic Information Registration Center.
Center. And is there a reason why the letters are out of order in Eric? Or
Have
am
I
I
got them out of
writing
order?
it wrong?
I think I probably have written it wrong. It probably should be Electronic Registration Information Center because Eric is the name of it, ERIC.
Right.
So I just typed it in the wrong order.
Okay, thank you.
Mistakes happen.
Yes, they do.
Okay, I'm not going to try to do the the next section of the book in 4 minutes. I talk quickly, but not that fast. Either email me if you want more information about the techniques for analyzing. Once you're suspicious, what do you do with the information? How do you find out whether it's real or not real? Before you move, before you report it to anybody, you need to be very sure that you're correct. You don't want to make a mistake. And so the question is, how do you know? How do you check it out? And there are sections in the book that talk about distortions of math, of arithmetic, how numbers are distorted, and how surveys are distorted and misused, and how you can tell whether a survey is reliable, a survey company is reliable or not. There's lots and lots of good information in the book.
Irene, what's your email address?
It's Heart Healthy, HEARTHEALTHY .Rubin9@gmail.com.
R, oh, did I get that? RUBIN. So I've got Heart Healthy.
Heart Healthy dot
Rubin.
Rubin9
Right.
at gmail.com.
All right, I'm putting that in the blog right now. There we go.
That's it.
And I did look on Amazon, and you're right, your book is there. They only had 5 copies left.
Oh, gee. I can't believe they had very many to start with.
Only good 5 copies left. So I don't know. I think the League of Women Voters maybe will order a copy for us, and we can distribute it through the group.
Yeah, that would be useful.
Well, maybe as a league, we could donate that to the public library so it would be available to more people.
Volunteer. Here's a reading list for the semester. All should be available used at the co-op.
What about your book, Dr. Landry?
Profiling is an upper level course.
Not sure who that is.
What is that?
I don't know. Somebody's got their.
A little bit of ridiculous fun.
I'm not sure who that is. So.
An envelope that makes you a passenger and a witness.
Caroline needs to mute. Caroline, you need to mute yourself.
Carolyn, John?
You are. What's up? You're the murderer. Giving your cover story. You're not getting the card that makes
It's
one.
not Cynthia.
There
Not
it is.
Carol. Well, it doesn't really matter. I think we are at the end of our evening here.
Yes, we are.
And I want to thank you. Carol Miner, did you have another question? Carol, you've been muted.
Now she's muted.
Okay. I just
There you
wanted to say thank you, Irene, for doing this work and for sharing it with us tonight.
Yes,
My pleasure.
very productive.
We all appreciate it very much. All right, it's right at 8:30.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you so much for coming.